This is Free to Exchange, the show where free-thinking scholars, free markets, and, ironically, free public television all meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. On today's show, we're going to examine two markets that aren't working well in the United States. The first is the labor market for teens and young adults. As our economy has recovered, rates of youth unemployment have remained disturbingly high. The second is the market for water. Texas and other states across the American West frequently face water shortages and restrict citizens' water usage. My first guest is Dr. Scott Beaulier. Dr. Beaulier is the Executive Director of the Center for Economic Liberty at Arizona State University. Dr. Beaulier is a policy expert and has frequently written and lectured on the problem of youth unemployment in the United States. Dr. Beaulier, Scott,
hey,
welcome to the show.
Great to be on. Great to see you.
So, for our viewers to start with, could you describe what the problem is? How bad is youth unemployment or young adult unemployment in the United States today?
So when we talk about young adult unemployment, we're talking about either age 16 to 29 or age 19 to 29, in that area. Starting out in your career after you finished college, or if you've chosen not to go to college, what does the job market look like for you? And what's happening in America and around the world is that these rates are disturbingly high. In Greece, it's up to 60%. In the United States, it's 17%, which is actually quite high compared to a national average rate of 6%. So it's always been a little bit higher
So
than
almost three times the national average.
almost three times the national
for young
average.
people.
That's right. And coming out of the Great Recession of 2008, we're realizing that it's just not improving as much as it is for other groups in the labor market. So your mid-career person's doing okay since the Great Recession. Unemployment rates for young adults are remaining stubbornly high, and they just seem to be stuck at about 17%.
So why? Is it just that the kids are different? These are millennials who are graduating now, or are they just lazy, weird, too busy playing with their iPhone or whatever?
Yeah. There's something to that. I think that a lot has been made of that millennials are just different than earlier generations. They're interacting with technology. They're not presenting themselves well when it comes to interviewing. There's some survey data on what millennials are doing in interviews. They're actually pulling out their phone. It'd be like me pulling out my phone on the set. Yeah. Right.
Gee, Scott, what you're saying is
you're not paying
really
attention to me.
Oh.
So about 20% of interviews are disrupted by millennials looking at their technology or getting texts during their interview. That's different than earlier times, but I don't think it's doing as much of the heavy lifting in this story as many are making out. Joel Steen from Time Magazine has made a really big deal about the me generation. My view is that every generation has been me. We have a little more technology adding fuel to it this time around, but that's not really where the action's at.
Yeah, I mean, well, you and I are both economists, so we don't tend to attribute this, people's behavior has changed. Right. Usually we say, what are the costs and what are the benefits? The constraints have changed and now we're getting a new outcome. So
that's right.
How have the constraints started changing?
Well, the big ones are that we're dealing with a weak economic recovery. You have Washington, D.C. and government officials trying to help. And when they're trying to help, many of the things that they're doing are actually completely counterproductive to this particular demographic, young adults.
So I mean, I have a rule of thumb that when I see something not working in the world and can't figure out why it's persisting, there's usually some government regulation or rule somewhere screwing people up from fixing the problem.
Absolutely.
So name me one of the ones that's going on in this market now that's starting to mess it up.
Well, it's very clear, and this is something that economists, both liberal economists and conservative economists, everyone on the spectrum agrees is disruptive to young adults, and particularly African American young adults, is the minimum wage. The minimum wage just disrupts natural agreements and voluntary contracts between two parties. It basically drives a wedge between what one is willing to pay for work and what one's willing to sell their work for. And you look at data going back to the 1990s, every time the minimum wage was increased from $4.25 when you and I were in the labor market to $7.25 now, in places like Seattle to $10 or $15, you see a jump in unemployment. And people will say, oh, you don't really notice that. That's not true. And it's actually a very targeted group. It's Black Americans who are young, trying to get their first jobs. It's other minorities. It's young adults, and it's tragic.
It's
and
teenagers
economists know this, you know.
Yeah, so I think this is an important point because a lot of people say, oh, you know, we don't see much unemployment from the minimum wage. Sure, it's something like 95, 97% of hourly employees earn more than the minimum anyway, or at least more than the federal minimum. So what you have to look at is that small subset.
Absolutely.
And you know, we can see it, right? If you go to Walmart.
Yep. Yeah, so what you see at places like Walmart is just the disruption where technology is substituting for labor. You actually had face-to-face transactions, people getting on their feet, learning to show up on time for their job, learning what a work ethic is, and those jobs are getting displaced by self-scan lines. The Walmart greeter at the front of the store isn't there anymore because it's just too costly for Walmart to employ that when the minimum wage goes up. And those jobs are menial. People, a lot of the millennials probably are like, I don't want that job. They want to jump to a really good job, but that's in fact how you move up the corporate ladder in many cases. You learn so many things from being a burger flipper or whatever your first job might have been.
You're an economics professor now
Yes.
and direct to center, but I bet your first job was something like
Sure
that.
was, McDonald's, yeah.
Mickey
and
D's.
I grew up in McDonald's. I've got ketchup in my blood still. And I actually worked up the ladder in college and was a manager of a McDonald's restaurant, and I learned so many life lessons just interacting with people at that age. And these opportunities are the ones that are really being missed now, thanks to just a weak economy, thanks to Obamacare, thanks to all kinds of government policies that are creating disincentives to even enter the labor market. And if you want to enter the labor market, you can't find a job. 40% unemployment for black young men.
That's awful. Now, you mentioned one thing while you were saying this. So the minimum wage is something economists have beat up for ages, and unfortunately politicians never learn or care not to learn. Mm-hmm. But you just mentioned Obamacare. What's Obamacare have to do with youth unemployment?
Yeah, it has a lot to do with it. So there's a number of different things in Obamacare that are creating rational labor market reactions from businesses. So one of them is the piece of Obamacare that says if you have more than 50 workers in your firm, you must provide insurance or face a $2,000 per worker penalty. So firms, they're rational entities maximizing profits, are responding to this saying, I'm not going to grow any bigger than 50 workers. They're called the 49ers, a whole series of firms maxing out their labor force at 49.
Not the 49ers that I prefer.
Not the 49ers who beat my Green Bay Packers every year. The 49ers, they're all over the place, firms that are not expanding because of Obamacare. You also have firms electing not to full-time employ workers. So I've mentioned the unemployment rate. There's another whole problem, the underemployment problem, people not working 40 hours or 35 hours a week, people working about 18 hours or 20 hours. And there's a whole set of workers, the Wall Street Journal reported on this a few months ago, whole set of workers who are working 20 hours at one job, going across the street to from Burger King to McDonald's and working 20 hours at another to get to about 40 hours of work. Why create those kinds of inefficiencies in a labor market? And
why are they doing that? Why don't they just work 40 hours at one?
Well, because they're not paying any. If they work 40 hours at one, they would have to be picked up by Obamacare then, and they'd have to be insured. So the firms are responding saying, I can't afford the insurance, I'm going to cap your hours at 20 hours, and individuals are doing the best they can in an environment that's basically an uphill battle for them.
Mm-hmm. And of course, if they're going to employ a worker and you have to provide health care for them, that's a kind of fixed cost for the employers. Would you want to employ a young marginal worker? Or
yeah,
it advantages someone who's more senior in the labor
Absolutely.
market, right?
So it leads to, these policies lead to discrimination. It's not that firms are naturally discriminating. It's you have two workers on your hands, why not take the one with more experience, and as opposed to just the completely wild card bet.
When the cost of hiring them is similar because you've got to buy the health insurance for either.
Exactly.
So there's another problem too in the labor market. So you've mentioned the unemployment, underemployment, and then there's the people who aren't even looking for jobs.
Absolutely.
So what is one of the factors of why have people just dropped out and they're not even job seeking anymore?
So that 17% rate indeed is just people looking for work. There's another whole group that's discouraged, frustrated, and another group who's just chosen the path of state aid and federal aid instead. And if you look at some of the data on the incentives being created by our welfare system, there's a whole range of income where it really doesn't make that much sense to work unless you're actually just really driven and saying, I want to have a job because this is what's going to be good for me for the long run. If you're just interested in what does the math indicate, there's a range from about $30,000 to about $55,000 if you're a single mother, where it's probably better to just stay on welfare than work. And this is tragic because it traps people into thinking about, if I work more, I'm losing benefits. And imagine that kind of thinking, and it's happening again and again to people who are basically trapped by the welfare state. They know it, but there's really nothing you can do unless you're going to suddenly jump from $30,000 pay to 70,000, and that's not happening to most people.
Right. So what's going on here is if they were earning 29,000, they qualify for food
Significant
stamps
benefits.
or child care benefits,
Yep.
health care or something.
Yep.
But then as they go to 35,000, they start losing those
get
benefits
sliced.
faster than their
Exactly.
income is increasing.
Yes.
So they have to jump from 30 to 60.
For the math to start to work, where you're, in terms of your total package at home, you're actually doing better than if you were just on welfare. Yeah, so there's a whole range at which you're actually losing by working. And when you're working, you're actually spending time in a job. So it's really tragic, and there's a lot of survey data, there's a lot of anecdotal data of people who are on welfare. They don't really want to be there, but it's a game where they're just basically stuck.
Where they have to take losses in the short run
Yes.
in order to improve their human capital.
Exactly.
And eventually earn their way
And
up
that's
to
an
making
odd
60.
bird that wants to do that.
In thinking of professions, I can think of basically only one where you go from about 20,000 in income to 60 or 70. That's PhD economist in training when
Right.
they're a grad student
Yes.
to their first job. There's a big jump, but
And
nobody else does.
There aren't a
this.
lot of those in that $30,000 area who are getting some welfare benefits. Yeah.
No, that's bizarre.
Yeah.
So we just have about a minute left. What's the best thing that we as United States citizens could do to help address this problem, do you think? Then?
Well, I think there's a lot of awareness about it now, and a recognition even among millennials and young adults that many of these gimmicks just actually aren't that good for them. The student loans that they've been encouraged to take on more and more, there's an awareness that, not every college degree is going to pay. And students have, really kind of awakened to this. And that's, I think, where our hope lies. The millennials are only going to address a millennial problem through awareness and through just some economic education. Hopefully a few more of them take your classes.
Or watch this show.
Exactly.
Thanks for joining us,
bet.
Scott.
Thank you.
Go grab a drink of water while you can. We'll be right back to discuss why so many states are running out of it.
Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Your favorite PBS shows, ready to watch when you are. Anytime, any place. Find more ways to explore than ever before.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Dr. Ryan Williams. Dr. Williams is an assistant professor of agricultural and applied economics here at Texas Tech University. He's also an expert researcher on how water markets work, or for that matter, don't work sometimes here in the United States. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Ben.
So, we're economists. When we see perpetual shortages of something, that tells me one thing: the price is wrong. Something's messed up. We don't run out of anything that the price is flexible of, virtually. What's going on with water markets in the United States? How do these things work?
Well, I think the underlying challenge with water is that you and I might have different beliefs about what water means to us as people and the history of water usage. And if you ask the average person about what water is needed for, they'll say, well, it's life-sustaining. Without water, we cease to exist. And so there's
True enough.
So there's historically an argument that everybody needs water. And as a function of that, I think some of the legal structure that would provide a framework for a market has led to things that are not exactly ideal for the price mechanism to work to allocate this really important resource. So historically in the United States, the doctrine that governed the rights for water was one of riparian rights.
Okay.
And that was born from common law in England, worked great in the wet eastern states as the United States was developed, but unfortunately in western arid and semi-arid regions of the United States, it doesn't work quite as well. And basically the riparian doctrine says if you have access to water on your land, on your property, then you have the right to that water, so long as it doesn't infringe upon somebody else's use of water on their property.
And if water is plentiful,
And if water is plentiful, if it comes every year, if it's a renewable resource, then you tend to not run into as many issues. But in the semi-arid and arid West, that doesn't work as well.
So how do we govern it here in let's take Texas, for example. How do we establish the water rights here?
So Texas is sort of born of this same idea, and it's essentially complete ownership. In the state of Texas, an individual that is a landowner has absolute ownership of their water resource, although that has been modified recently as the state of Texas has tried to do things to control a little bit of the water resource. But absolute ownership basically means that if I have a piece of property and I have water resource on that property, I can use as much of it as I want. I can treat it however I wish to use it, and there's nothing that stops me from using it. Now, unfortunately, with groundwater resources, what that means is if I pull water from underneath my land at a rate faster than those neighbors around me, I'm potentially taking their water as well. And because there aren't dividers that go down from our property lines.
Of course not. So it's a kind of what economists would call a classic tragedy of the commons here, where everybody
Correct.
pumps water too quickly because it's the others who bear the cost of
Correct.
this.
You have a rivalrous good. If I drink a bottle of water, it's no longer available for you to drink. But when it comes to a common groundwater resource, then there's nothing stopping me from accessing that water.
And this is one of the reasons why we're depleting water too quickly here in Texas.
We're depleting water quickly here in Texas. I don't know about the too quickly. I think that that's a question that bears further discussion.
Okay. So how about other places? So we're dry here in West Texas, but I know as I drive west from here, things turn even browner as I go through New Mexico.
Sure, exactly. And New Mexico is actually a very interesting case, because when New Mexico formed as a state, they sort of rejected the founding fathers' writing in the Constitution referring to riparian rights, and they decided that the water in the state was the people's water, and that it would be allocated based upon prior appropriation. So if you wanted to have the right to use water, you sought permission to use the water for a beneficial purpose. So
Whoa, wait a second. So the people's water.
the people's water.
That means it's actually nobody's water, and the government's going to decide who uses it.
Ultimately, that's correct. So from a free market perspective, it's a little bit tough to swallow. Essentially, what you're saying is that there's a certain amount of water that is available to the people of the state of New Mexico, that is available for different uses, that is a sustainable amount of water. Now, that requires a tremendous amount of foresight to pick that number. But then what it provides is, once you pick that number, whatever that number happens to be, then the appropriation of that water can go to high-valued uses of the water.
Determined by who?
Well, initially, so the question is, what is considered a beneficial use, right? Determined by some government agency. So that's potentially a problem. But beneficial uses are going to be industrial, municipal, agricultural. If the water is being used for something productive, most likely it's going to be considered a beneficial use.
Well, to me, anything anybody uses water for is by definition a beneficial use to them.
Sure.
So we need a hierarchy once we're going to limit how much they use. Usually would say the price mechanism does that.
Okay, and then so this is one of the beautiful things about what New Mexico has done.
Okay, I'm glad we're getting to beauty.
Is that the individual who has prior appropriation to use their water that they have the right for, if they find that it is more beneficial to them to sell that right to somebody else who wants to use it for a beneficial use. So for instance, if I'm an individual who is using it for agricultural production, and somebody comes and offers me a price for my water right that exceeds the value that it generates in my agricultural production, say somebody that's in oil and gas extraction wants to use that water resource and they compensate me for that water right, then I'm free to accept that compensation.
Okay, so this actually makes water sound like it makes a little bit of sense in New Mexico. Once the government bureaucrat determines what he thinks is high valued use, the secondary
Yes.
market actually can sort this out.
There is potentially a secondary market that allows for the transaction of water rights. It doesn't necessarily have to be tied to the land. So if I'm a landowner and I have a water right with that land, I don't have to sell my land, I can sell my water right.
Okay, well seems like we found one place where it's starting to make sense. Let's just do one other, because California is always fun to poke at, and I know you're originally from there.
That's right.
California, the Central Valley, should be a desert, and instead it's full of farming that gets water. How does California do this?
Well, so California was historically a riparian state as well, that those who had access to the water was sort of a first in use, first in right. And the problem in California is that the dynamic between groundwater and surface water is they're very closely tied. And so the groundwater rights are now a proportional right. So anybody that has a right to a groundwater resource has a right to use a proportion commensurate with their right of an amount that is then determined by some sort of government agency.
How well does this work?
It doesn't work perfectly or great, but on the flip side, there are cases in California where there is trading of water rights that is occurring from upstream users to downstream users, where people are being allowed to and encouraged to trade their water rights.
Sure. And there's also massive subsidies in California.
Sure.
When you look at the aqueduct piping from the north and from the Sierra down to
right.
people paying.
I grew up in a town where it rained. It seemed like it rained all year long. I joke that if I look at my phone at what the weather's like, it's 50 degrees and raining in my hometown. And we used to have watering restrictions in my hometown. When I would visit people in Sacramento, if you live in the city of Sacramento, historically, this isn't the case anymore, but for a long time, people paid a flat monthly fee for access to water at their residence. So it didn't matter how much they used. There was no price mechanism. You just paid a flat fee.
All right, dude. So you've struck a nerve here. So we're in Lubbock, Texas here at Texas Tech talking about this. And we had stage 2 water restrictions last summer. Stage 1 water restrictions persist for an even longer period of time. These things make me nuts. When
How
I
does
see
how does your lawn look?
lousy, but I'm not very good at taking care of it. But when I see water restrictions, this tells me one thing: the price is wrong. If the price were right, you wouldn't need to tell me how to use it, right?
Certainly. Part of the problem with water has historically been this underlying belief that we need water, that it is a fundamental human need to have access to water, and so we underprice the water resource, especially the acquired, cleaned, and transported water that we get when we turn on our tap. I mean, it's sort of water and electricity are the two things that when we walk into our homes as people in the United States, we expect that we flip on the light switch and the lights come on, and we expect that when we turn on the tap, clean and flowing water comes out.
I think that's a good expectation.
Do you know how much you pay for your water?
I have no idea.
Do you know how much water you use when you take a shower?
A lot, because it takes a long time for it to get hot.
But you have no idea, right? And so
No.
part of the problem is that clearly we don't have an appropriate pricing mechanism, because if you knew those things, it would be because you knew how much it was costing you to continue an activity, right? As scarcity of a good or service increases, we typically experience a higher and higher marginal cost, right? You should pay a higher marginal cost for the last unit of water as compared to the first unit of water that you use.
I think this is an important point, because diamonds are more scarce than water in Lubbock, but there's no diamond shortage where the government says, well, actually you can only use diamonds for engagements because that's a more important purpose than something else. But that's what they do with water. And people's reaction is often, well, water's essential for human life, but the point you're making is the last units of water any of us use aren't essential at all. They're trivial tasks, right?
That's correct.
I mean, how much water do we need per day to live? Everybody could afford that under a market price of water.
Yes.
It's do I need the second shower today? Should I water my lawn? Should I be careless with my faucets type things?
Correct. And then another interesting point is that when we have these watering restrictions, so rather than pricing water appropriately, you impose a water restriction. Well, now you have this confounding effect that your residents in your city aren't using water, and therefore you're not generating revenues from the use of that water. And those revenues, largely the pricing of water is to support the conveyance and the system that gets that water delivered to your home. Well, then how do you pay for the infrastructure if you aren't generating the revenues necessary to do so?
And you end up in an awful kind of catch-22.
Yes.
Man, I wish we could get some rationality to water pricing here in Lubbock and other places. Thanks for joining me, Ryan.
You're welcome.
We discussed two different markets today, youth employment and markets for water. Neither one are working well. When I see a market that's consistently failing to clear, I usually have to assume that there's some regulation or some bureaucrat that's stopping it from happening. Otherwise, entrepreneurs seeking profits tend to iron these things out over time. In the case of youth unemployment, it's government regulations that raise the cost of hiring young people that make businesses not do it or incentivize young people to sit on the sideline. Getting rid of these regulations would dramatically lower youth unemployment. In the case of water, the price is wrong. We use too much of it and we use it for the wrong things because we don't pay a price that reflects its real scarcity to other people's. If we got market prices in here, both of these markets would work better. See you next time.